Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a super dark but honestly deeply fascinating aspect of human history. We're looking at how some of history's absolute most powerful rulers are remembered, not for what they built, and definitely not for their kindness or innovations, but for the sheer, unadulterated terror they left in their wake. These are figures who commanded vast empires and controlled millions of lives, yet their go-to tool for governance was just fear.
It's kind of wild when you think about it, right? It's this massive paradox of history. You have these individuals sitting on thrones of enormous empires, yet their vast power is completely overshadowed by unimaginable cruelty. Instead of leaving this lasting legacy of prosperity, their names echo through time purely because of the extreme violence they relied on to stay in power.
So that really begs the ultimate question about leadership and humanity. What exactly pushes a leader to become a monster? Is it a calculated strategy to maintain control, or is it more of a slow descent into total madness and paranoia? It's a psychological puzzle that historians have literally debated for centuries.
To figure that out, here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with a legacy of brutality, move into fear as a weapon, and track the descent into madness. Then we'll hit the modern terror, unpack the psychology of cruelty, and finally look at power without compassion.
All right, let's jump right into part 1. The legacy of brutality.
And moving right along to part 2, fear as a weapon.
Think about the totally terrifying logic of Vlad the Impaler for a second. Impalement was a horrifically slow, agonizing fate. But Vlad didn't just punish people behind closed doors. Oh no. He used thousands of bodies as this gruesome billboard right outside his city walls, specifically to shock and terrify invading armies. His absolute greatest defense was sheer psychological warfare.
And this perfectly captures how historical terror morphs into myth. Vlad's real-life actions were so insanely bloody that they burned right into our cultural memory, directly inspiring the legendary fictional vampire Dracula. It just completely cements his dark legacy in a way very few historical figures ever experience.
Now, jumping over to the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan is, well, he's a really complex historical figure to look at objectively. On one hand, he was a brilliant tactician. His fast armies connected massive global trade routes all across Asia and Europe. But on the other hand, that expansion required the absolute destruction of entire cities and the deaths of literally millions who refused to surrender.
Which brings us to part 3, descent into madness. Take Russia's first Tsar, Ivan the Terrible. His reign is honestly just a tragic shift in leadership. He actually started out as a really intelligent, strong, and capable ruler. But after years of grueling war and severe personal tragedy, intense suspicion just totally took over. He created this ruthless secret police force to punish alleged betrayals, a madness that peaked when he struck and killed his very own son in a violent argument. Meanwhile, over in ancient Rome, Emperor Nero gives us a totally different flavor of madness. His deep obsession with luxury and absolute power stood in stark contrast to the massive suffering of his heavily taxed people. He harshly executed anyone who challenged him, but that level of cruelty ultimately backfired, sparked a massive rebellion, and collapsed his empire.
You've probably heard the famous story about Nero happily playing his lyre while Rome burned to the ground. Now, historians still debate if he literally stood there and watched it happen, but the fact that this rumor even survived highlights a deeper truth. His complete disregard for his suffering citizens was so notorious, it absolutely guaranteed his downfall.
Let's fast forward a bit to part 4, the modern terror.
Under Joseph Stalin's iron grip in the Soviet Union, fear wasn't just a tactic, it was everyday life. Millions vanished into harsh prison camps known as gulags. Citizens were disappeared for the most minor criticisms of the government. The paranoia was so intense that Stalin famously had his political enemies literally airbrushed out of official photographs to just completely erase them from history.
Looking at this impartially, we're faced with a terrifying historical trade-off. Stalin undeniably built the Soviet Union into a highly powerful global superpower. However, this geopolitical strength was purchased at the horrific cost of his own people's freedom, their livelihoods, and millions of their lives. So why do this? Let's get into part 5, the psychology of cruelty. When you zoom out and look across all these centuries, the motivations are actually incredibly consistent. Cruelty often stemmed from a desperate desire to maintain absolute power during times of intense chaos. They fundamentally believed fear was the only reliable way to stop rebellion.
Yet ironically, relying on fear breeds isolation, which results in a profound paranoia that ultimately destroys the ruler from the inside out.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 6, Power Without Compassion.
The biggest takeaway from all these historical sources is pretty undeniable. When humanity and empathy are replaced by fear and strict control, the resulting power is never a constructive force. It's entirely destructive, causing immense pain, widespread destruction, and lasting generational trauma.
Because, think about it, no matter how many vast trade routes they built, or sprawling empires they expanded, or global superpowers they forged, history has a funny way of stripping away the political achievements to reveal the human cost. Ultimately, history defines these monarchs solely by their worst atrocities.
These stories aren't just dusty old chapters in a textbook, they are living warnings. So I'll leave you with this to consider. As we build new systems of power today, how do we ensure that our leaders never again trade their compassion for absolute control? Thank you so much for exploring this with me, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.